Yeah, you make some really strong assertions in the book that I absolutely love, and we're definitely going to talk about some of those things. I think most people on the street would hear the term vegetable oil and think it was ludicrous to say that that would be an unhealthy thing. Like, what's so wrong about oils and what's so wrong about vegetables? Like, that sounds that sounds great, right? I stole this from one of our other guests, Dr. Dave Champion, as he basically was taking his camera down the grocery aisles and all of the different bottles and all the different oils and pointed out, look at all of this vegetable oil in every one of these bottles. Not one drop comes from vegetables. Crazy.
No, right. Yeah, the term vegetable oil is a euphemism, and as far as I can tell, it was coined in the very early 20th century. I really think for the same reasons that it baffles us today that we're not calling these what they really are, which is mostly seed oils or a bean oil in the case of soybeans. But these are mostly seed oils. They don't come from vegetables. But I think they used that to try to make these sound healthy, because people in the 19th century, when vegetable oils were first introduced, and that was cottonseed oil, right after the American Civil War, 1866, people didn't want to eat cottonseed oil because they knew that oils back in those days were only known for their use as lamp oil or machine oil, or possibly in the case of fertilizer. And so they really had to sneak these into the food supply, and they mostly did that through by mixing the oils with butter to create margarine, or eventually, creating Crisco, which contains partially hydrogenated oils. But anyway, it was basically to take the place of lard. And so that's what they were doing. They were trying to compete with butter and lard primarily. And then they also, in the late 19th century, began to adulterate olive oil with cottonseed oil. And but anyway, back to the term vegetable oil. That was again, that's a euphemism coined in the early 20th century, and it's stuck, and it works. And I have friends who are physicians and very, very knowledgeable, intelligent people, and they've told me, they said, one of the first things they thought when I would present this to them is, or they'd see me present it, is vegetable oil dangerous, really? And yeah, it's shocking that based on the name, we've all been fooled, and we've been fooled, for about a century and a half. In this regard. And but yeah, they're very dangerous. So we'll get into that.
We'll get into that. Yeah, for sure. I don't think a lot of people realize Crisco, it tells you exactly what it is. It stands for crystallized cottonseed, Crisco. That's how they got the name. Now, you mentioned cottonseed as being the primary, vegetable seed oil of the time. The story that I've always heard is that since our cotton production was going up so much, we were using cotton gins that was starting to become invented. We just had so many of these seeds laying around, and they were going rancid because they're a polyunsaturated oil. And so we had to figure out something to do with them. It's difficult to know if that's the exact history, but from your research, is that more true than not, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they were producing cottonseed oil in the 1700s and 1800s. So they, on a very, very small scale, again, because there wasn't much application. And eventually they began to feed the cottonseed oil to cattle, and they determined that they could feed it to cattle and it didn't kill them. And so really, this is when they began to try to get people to buy cottonseed oil, in a container. They were in cans, and of course, this didn't go over very well. People weren't interested in buying cottonseed oil as a food. Nobody would have ever, if you would have mentioned the term vegetable oil, or even cottonseed oil in 1865 to any American, they would have known that as either a lamp oil or a machine oil for the most part, and they would not have ever considered that we could be eating this. And again, like I said, so they really had to sneak it into the food.
Okay. Okay. So that 1965 seems to be the date when all this kind of got started. So 1966,
1865.
maybe eight, excuse me,
Yeah, yeah,
1865, 1866. Okay.
right.
So let's talk about human diets before that time. We know, we were just getting into the Industrial Revolution, and we'd also had the agricultural evolution, maybe 10 to 14,000 years prior to that. What was our basically consumption of some of the harmful components of vegetable oil prior to 1865?
Yeah, great question, Casey. So, me and my team we're trying to get a paper published that actually addresses this. The short answer really is that the world had precious few oils for consumption up through 1865. And honestly, I won't be able to go through them in detail because it's kind of it's a lot of detail. But in essence, you have like you have olive oil that goes back many thousands of years, and had very small consumption of various other oils. You had there was some coconut oil, for example. There was some palm oil that goes way back in history, right? But these were just in a nutshell, to keep this brief, these were isolated in their consumption, to certain geographic areas. And overall, probably 99% of the world really didn't have any oils up through the American Civil War. Like the United States had no oils whatsoever up through the American Civil War ending in 1865, with the exception of olive oil. And it would have been precious small amounts. So it would have been a very small fraction of a gram per person per day overall, because very few people, would ever even see or ever touch an olive oil. So am I answering your question, Casey?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. And about the same time, we were also getting better at refining sugar, which, sugar was so exceedingly rare and difficult to find and very expensive that for many hundreds of years, if you got some, it was only the elite that would get some, and it would be very little, be high demand, very pricey. And once we started to realize that we could use sugar beets to produce more sugar, all of a sudden the per capita consumption of sugar also rose kind of around that same time, maybe not exactly the same year, but around that century, correct?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you said it exactly right. Sugar was an expensive commodity up until the late 19th century. The price really started coming down, and Americans in the 19th century loved their sweets. They did, and this is why by 1890, right at around 10% of the diet, I'm quite sure that was sugar in the American diet in 1890. But at that time, the vegetable oils were still roughly, in terms of cottonseed oil, would have been less than a gram per day, so very small amount. And then of course we got, this has always been the problem is, sugar has gone up a lot, and vegetable oils have gone up a lot. And so in general, it's been hard to try to determine, which is the culprit, which is the villain, which is the problem in this. And that's really where I've focused a lot of work in the last few years, is kind of trying to decipher what that is and tease that apart.